Hi, everybody. I'm Diane Brady. I'm here with Ian Bremmer, noted author, founder, president of Eurasia Group, and also a colleague who was at APEC last week.
Indeed.
Ian, I wanted to get your take on that. Let's start. Obviously, a lot of the attention was on the meeting between President Xi and President Biden. Good news?
Um, Certainly welcome news. Not uniquely good news, but I mean, the fact that they met for 4 hours on the back of a lot of planning and the meeting on the various topics went as well as expected, in a couple of places a little better than expected. Set against a context of very deeply challenging geopolitical conflict that is getting worse. I think pretty much everyone at APEC, not just the Americans and the Chinese, not just the private sector, but all the other countries, they really want to see a little more stability, a little less uncertainty in this relationship. I think we can say we came away with that.
So you said some of it went better than expected. Anything specifically that surprised you?
Two places that were a little warmer. One was that the agreement on fentanyl is a bigger deal than expected. The fact is the Chinese have already taken down a number of the companies that they were talking about that are putting out precursor ingredients for fentanyl that are exported, and a lot of them are making their way to the United States, including to San Francisco, where APEC was hosted. So that is welcome, and it matters for the election. Of course, it's a domestic issue that has just been a disaster for American public policy and for communities across the country. Secondarily, the fact that four new high-level channels are being established immediately on military to military conflict. You know that over the past months, we've seen increasing numbers of near misses between U.S. and Chinese military, particularly aircraft, operating in the region, and the potential of that to lead to an unintended military conflict between two countries that nobody wants to see is real. And the Americans have been asking ever since the pandemic to get those military conversations to deconflict the two countries in the incidents of those incidents. They want to see that happen. The Chinese have said no because the Chinese perspective has been that allowing deconfliction gives the Americans freer rein to act in risky ways and know that it's not going to escalate. So in other words, it's giving the Americans more control on escalation. And the Chinese decided to back off of that and go ahead with that engagement. And I think we should not underappreciate how important that is. Okay, maybe it doesn't matter day to day, but anything that makes it less likely that we have a sudden crisis between the two most powerful countries, two largest economies in the world, I think is a big deal. The rest of it went pretty much as expected, but I would also just put a pin in the fact that the Americans making it clear to the Chinese that there would be no unexpected negative surprises during this trip gave China, facing a lot of domestic economic headwinds and the first negative foreign direct investment numbers since you've seen records starting to be kept on that, they really leaned into that. And as a consequence, you saw a charm offensive with the private sector in attendance and also with a number of other countries in attendance, like Australia, like South Korea. And I spoke with a lot of those leaders and they've been seeing it. I think that China would have been less willing to do that if they thought that, Biden might suddenly come out with, new export controls, new tariffs, sort of a more hostile stance. So the Chinese felt more comfortable, if you will, showing a little leg in this meeting, in the summit meeting more broadly, than I think that Xi Jinping normally. He's been quite risk averse typically in these summits. That ended up being helpful too.
Well, it's worthwhile noting he did not actually address the CEO summit, which is something he has done in previous years. I wonder if some of this is also with an eye to what's happening in 2024, the possibility that Trump would come back in who has a very different worldview on engaging with China.
Well, first of all, you're right. He didn't attend the CEO summit. He was supposed to give a speech, and he pulled the day before. But he also put on his schedule a dinner that was pay to play, but still with all the big American CEOs there, and spent a lot of time with them and gave a very warm and friendly speech to them and had a little bit of, sort of engagement one-on-one with some of them as well. So in that regard, I don't think anyone came away from the trip saying, oh, Xi Jinping wasn't engaged. In fact, he had a surprise meeting with the Japanese Prime Minister Kishida for over an hour. First time those two men have met in over a year. So that was a big deal too. So again, I wouldn't make too much out of the fact that he didn't do the CEO
that's fair.
summit. Yeah, but so I'm sorry. The other question was
was with regard to Trump.
That
given what's happening in the polls, the possibility that he would come back. I don't know if that's affecting the mindset. Again, I know that you are not, looking through the eyes of Xi Jinping, but I would imagine that's something that would be on their minds.
Look, I spoke with a lot of the leaders there, obviously, and I would say that unlike most other leaders in the region who certainly fear a Trump presidency, I don't think that Xi Jinping has made up his mind. I mean, certainly in terms, again, I don't know Xi, but in terms of his leadership, I think they're not sure. There's a lot of consistency between Biden and Trump's orientation on China. Certainly, if you look at the tariffs, certainly if you look at the policy on Taiwan. I mean, you could argue Trump was a little softer on technology, on semiconductors. Biden ramped that up and combined it with industrial policy, the CHIPS Act. So maybe Biden's a little tougher. Certainly Trump is a little bit harder to predict. And that means, both that he can, drive wedges between the U.S. and its allies, which the Chinese might welcome, but could also, get more angry with the Chinese and cause trouble all of a sudden. So it's more uncertain. I don't know. I mean, certainly everybody there, not just the Chinese, recognize that Trump can easily become the next president. In fact, if there were election today, he'd probably win. And that is unnerving a lot of American allies around the world. I don't think that has had a significant impact on Xi's meetings in San Francisco.
I think that's fair. And obviously, stability is important. Let's pivot to the part of the world that is not stable right now. And, one of, I guess you could say, because we've got Ukraine as well. But Israel-Hamas war, in terms of what's on your radar right now with regard to developments there?
Release of some hostages appears to be imminent. I know people have been saying that for the last few weeks, but truly a deal seems to be just about inked. That will be a positive, of course, for the Israelis at home, of course, for the Americans. And I think everybody wants to see a lot of those hostages coming home. It's been 6 weeks. And I mean, we're not just talking about, military age men. We're talking about women. We're talking about children that have been held. And so any success there, which in turn would lead to what we're hearing would be a 5-day humanitarian pause in fighting that maybe could facilitate some direct diplomacy, not between Israel and Hamas, certainly, but perhaps between the Israelis and the Palestinian Authority, perhaps between the Israelis and some of the Gulf states, the Jordanians, the Egyptians. That would be welcome. The Americans will try. So let's see. But at the same time, we're seeing more violence in the West Bank. We're seeing more violence between Hezbollah and the Israeli Defense Forces as well. So we are still in a context where, I mean, people are talking about a ceasefire, but the reality is trying to contain this from getting much worse. That is still the reality as to where the war is right now.
Before we move on, just one question there. Is there a possibility of a ceasefire working against Israel because it gives time for, in essence, the enemies to regroup?
Of course. I mean, that is the downside, is that any day you're not fighting is a day that your enemy can try to conceal where they are, how they're operating, better plan for attacks against Israel. I will say that we have to recognize that there are two wars going on here. There's the military fighting on the ground where the Israelis are overwhelmingly the more powerful country. Gaza is not a country, I mean, to be fair, but I mean territory. The Israelis have the intelligence, they have the technology, they have a much larger armed forces, much better trained. And the fact that Hamas was able to commit the terrorist atrocities they were is in large part because the Israelis took their eye off the ball. But that's not happening now. So
Yeah.
I will say that on balance, I'm a little less concerned about existential threat to Israel from not fighting for a week or two or three. And I am more concerned about the impact of the Israelis losing the information war. And they are losing the information war.
Yeah.
Maybe that's not fair, because, of course, Hamas is more responsible for the deaths of Palestinian civilians than the Israelis are. They're not wholly responsible. Israel has some responsibility, but the Palestinians are more. They're not. The fact is that the way the rest of the world perceives this is increasingly, despite the acts of October 7th, that Israel is responsible.
Right.
And
I think you're right.
some of that is because there are a lot more Muslims. Some of that is because there's anti-Semitism. Some of that is just because of the sheer numbers of Palestinian civilians getting killed and not recognizing that Hamas is operating in those hospitals, is operating, in those civilian areas. But, it may not be fair that the Israelis are losing the information war, but they are. And so if you're Israel, you have to factor that in. Because if you start losing public opinion in the United States, you start losing the Democrats in the United States, and they're running the country right now, that can have permanent impact on Israel.
Sure.
And refusing to accept that reality as part of the fight is a very serious challenge.
Yeah, no, definitely. Let me end with a part of the world that we don't often talk about, Argentina.
Yeah.
These
Yes.
elections, this new president, Javier Milei, what do you
Yeah.
make of it? I mean, I was going to say, I'm not even going to say the word nutty. People in glass houses. What do you make of this election?
He is, let us say, unorthodox as a candidate / president. And it does go to just how poorly the Peronistas have driven the economy into the dirt in Argentina, that the people of the country were willing to vote, against Massa, who is the finance minister of the Fernandez, the Kirchnerist government, and instead bet on someone who promises to take a chainsaw to the government, who promises to own the libtards, as he calls them, who promises to shut down many ministries in the government. He's not going to be able to do any of those things because he has not a single governor. He has only a minority in Congress. He has no experience, and he does not have an economic team. So he's going to fail. But people are really angry, and they're ready to break things. And dollarization in Argentina, will require an incredible fiscal constraint that is going to cause even more poverty in a country that right now has virtually no central bank reserves. So if you think it was bad in Argentina over the last year with 140% plus inflation, it is about to get much worse.
To your point, there's a lot limits on what he can do for the reasons that you said in terms of his power base. But how much damage can he do? What would you be like? What is the danger for here? Because obviously he's promised a lot of things that scare a lot of people. Any sense of where he can actually do damage or do good? Let's give him a chance, I suppose.
I think there is going to be a real effort to dollarize the economy. And the problem is that he's not going to have support in Congress for it. And it's also going to be incredibly expensive to do. And in order to make that happen, he's going to have to print a lot more in the short term. So it's not, he can eventually dollarize. He can move away from the peso. He can blow up the central bank of Argentina. But the near-term costs of that are going to be immense. And he also could easily be drummed out, though I think he'll hang on very tenaciously because he won, and he won big. He won by 11 points.
Yeah, that's
but
a huge
the strength
margin.
of the opposition is in stopping this from happening is going to be very, very heavy indeed. So it's going to be a huge fight. And of course, as always, the people that are principally punished will be the Argentines.
Anything else on your radar, Ian, to put on ours before we sign
Nobody
off.
asks me about Russia, Ukraine anymore. And, this war is still going on, and
Yeah.
the Russians are still occupying that territory, and they're still engaging in even more regular rocket attacks against the Ukrainian population. They are committing war crimes, and the ability of anyone to stop them is looking increasingly difficult. So, I mean, I just
Yeah.
don't want to forget about that conflict. It's major, and it should be on our screens.
You're right. Banality of evil. Thank you very much for joining us,
Thank
and
you.
I look forward to continuing the conversation. Thanks, Ian.